Let me begin by saying thank you, everybody. I am Andrew Culp. I'm the professor of media history and theory at the California Institute of the Arts in the School of Critical Studies in the program of Aesthetics and Politics. I want to first say thank you to the City of West Hollywood for co-sponsoring this whole series with us. Without their generous support over the many years that we've worked together, it could never happen. I'd also like to thank CalArts as a school, Critical Studies, and the MA in Aesthetics and Politics in particular. And I just draw everyone's attention to a recent blog post, Shallow Aesthetics, Reproduction of Social Media, on our Open Assembly platform. One of our graduate students, Jane, recently constructed in order to invite us into Nick's generous work. And it's about the commodification of visual materials, particularly Breonna Taylor in Say Her Name and the other BLM related campaigns. I'd also like to thank you as an audience for tuning in today. It's a Friday evening. I'm sure people have a lot of things. And note that this session will be archived to view later and to share with other people. This talk is going to be part of a longer series called the West Hollywood Aesthetics and Politics Program. It's been going on since 2011 through the Aesthetics and Politics Program. And it has hosted artists, theorists, architecture practitioners, and people from all walks of life to help really engage timely issues of our day. This semester, we're doing a semester-long series convened by me on the topic of blackout on the surveillance of blackness. It's inspired by the work of Simone Brown and her writing about how the black targets of surveillance technology sometimes are asked to visibility, but in fact, sometimes might not seek visibility in their goal. Instead, helps prompt us to look for fugitive acts of escape, resistance, and productive disruptions that happen when blackness enters the frame. I'll note that for our format, there's going to be a presentation by our distinguished guest tonight. Then there's going to be a conversation with our respondent. And after that, we'll hold a question and answer. For those of you all joining in on YouTube Live, I suggest that please join in any way that you want, contributing, chatting along, marking key phrases, quoting things, linking, and that we'll be collecting some of the chat in order to help contribute to the Q&A portion later. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker. It's going to be Nicholas Mirzoeff. He's going to be speaking to us about racialized surveillance capitalism. I'll allow him to introduce his own title, but I want to give you a brief biography. He's a visual activist. He works at the intersection of politics, race, and the global visual culture. He's a professor in media, culture, and communication at NYU. And in this year, he's serving as a Mellon ACLS Scholar and Society Fellow in residence at the Magnum Foundation. He's the author and editor of 11 books, most recently The Appearance of Black Lives Matter, and a number of articles that are absolutely important in our current moment, as well as ongoing really intensive work in monument and museum protests, especially in New York, but across the globe. He'll be joined later for the conversation by Aria Dean, who is the editor and curator at Rhizome. She's helped launch the program for a online-only net art anthology, which I suggest everyone check out if they haven't had a chance. It's absolutely magnificent. And that project resulted in the catalog, The Art Happens Here Net Art Anthology. In addition to that, she works as a writer and an artist and published a number of really excellent pieces. Perhaps a major high point for a lot of people might have been Poor Meme, Rich Meme, which I think got extensive circulation and quite well due. And we're just so excited to have both of them. So please, as an audience, welcome me in joining Nick to begin his talk for tonight.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I'm just very thrilled to be hosted by two such dear institutions to my heart, CalArts and also the City of West Hollywood, where I lived a number of years ago, many years ago now, when I was first in the United States. So it's a great pleasure to be, as it were, with you. I, of course, regret not being there in person very much. Missed my time in LA. Hopefully some, at the moment, unimaginable point in the future, we'll be able to reconvene in person. So I'm also honored and humbled to have Aria as the respondent today and really looking forward to that conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to just kind of jump into this. So what I'm going to be offering for you this evening is a reflection on histories of whiteness, which I'm calling white space, white seeing, and white out. And I want to argue to you that unlike the technical infrastructures of media, The infrastructures of whiteness are both designed to be visible, like monuments and museums, and they're comprised of ways of seeing that I call white seeing. White seeing has a set of its own modalities, first of which is identifying difference. So for those of us familiar with the writings of Frantz Fanon, you might remember the moment where he is encountered by a young French child on a train who says to him, "Look, a Negro," and then turns to his mother and says, "Mama, I'm frightened," identifying difference. There's then the identification of other white persons. Canonically, I could show you here, the meeting between Henry Morton Stanley and Dr. Livingstone in what is now Zimbabwe. And Stanley wrote, "I must not let my face betray my emotions, lest it detract from the dignity of a white man appearing under such extraordinary circumstances." In other words, meeting another white person is always a ceremony, it's always a performance that must be properly conducted without emotion. Now, the third category is what I'm going to call erasing. I'm going to talk a lot about that during the course of this evening. I want now to think about the ways in which the intersection of infrastructure with ways of seeing creates what I'm going to call white space. In the practices of settler colonialism in the Americas, you can see here, as I'm showing you from Mexico City, the way in which peoples were separated as a practice of colonization, which then, according to the historians of colonial Mexico, produces racialization rather than reflecting some presumed original racial difference. It's done by separating people, and those people, having been separated, are then racialized. This then erases indigenous and other than human life and extends from the internal colonization of Europe in the early Middle Ages to exogenous settler colonialism and indeed to present day gentrification. So the result of all these ways of seeing and its interaction with material practices and infrastructure is what Fanon once called the aesthetic of respect for the established order. And here's Fanon speaking in Accra at the time of the independence of Ghana in 1958. The established order is then that which makes things ordinary, it makes things everyday, but they are built-in material practices which come to take on an aesthetics, not the aesthetics so much of the beautiful as the aesthetics in the way that we feel something is right. And the state does a great deal of this with its flags and its military and uniforms and the appropriate manner of doing things. And when we feel something is appropriate, then we give it respect. And that is the kind of aesthetics that Fanon is describing here. As Andrew mentioned, I want to try and think about how these aesthetics, how this practice of white seeing might be what I call whited out. That is to say, one might undo the established order and create a different way of thinking. This deploys then the concept of abolition from the Black radical tradition. But I want to do that without co-opting or claiming it, but to think about how we, those of us who are identified or identify as white, might come to make use of it. So the assemblage created by white seeing in white space is what I call racializing surveillance capitalism. And I'm bringing together here the concept of racializing surveillance from Simone Brown, whose work underpins this whole lecture series. And by the way, both Simone and myself are also speaking in a series called Visualizing Abolition at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And I hope some of you might be interested in joining in those sessions, a remarkable set of speakers that are present. So if I take Simone's concept of surveillance producing racialization and intersect it with Cedric Robinson's classic concept of racial capitalism. Now, what Robinson means here then is that rather than racism being produced by capitalism or vice versa, that they are coeval, that they grew up together, but long before the regimes of plantation slavery. He classic text, Black Marxism, traces this back to the 9th century and the internal colonization of Europe. If we add to that here, Catherine McKittrick's excellent concept, which I really like, a plantation time space. And what McKittrick is talking about here is the way that the plantation produces futures. And one of those futures she describes is contemporary urban space, and another would be the regime of mass incarceration. This making visible of whiteness as a racial regime within folded white time space is what I'm trying to outline here. It folds back and forth in the manner of Photoshop, containing a presumed whole out of assembled time spaces. So in this sense, everything that I'm talking about is what part of what Grace Lee Boggs used to call the time on the clock of the world, or simply the contemporary. It's not a history, it's a call to action. White supremacy, then, is a racial regime that forms conjunctures out of the intersections of time-space. Whiteness works, as it were, as an ideology. It creates respect, and creates an aesthetics because it provides a frame to sustain the contradictions of everyday life. As Stuart Hall put it in his Meditations on Gramsci, it articulates into configuration different subjects, different identities, different projects, different aspirations. It does not reflect, but constructs a unity out of difference. So here then, it's important to understand that whiteness is always white supremacy. It articulates the sense that only fully white people are fully human, because there are hierarchies within whiteness. There are white people held not to be fully white. Often those people are Jews. But in Britain, for example, where I'm from, at the moment, Polish people and other Eastern Europeans are not considered to be properly white for the purposes of defining the new post-Brexit nation state, even though on any visible measure, they are obviously very light-skinned. Any equality then within the regime of whiteness would only ever be temporary, or an individual equality to that supremacy, which violently resists being challenged, as we know. And we've seen this in the pandemic. To appear with a gun while being white is a statement of freedom. To appear with a gun while being black is cause for the police to kill you or to shoot at you. Whiteness, I want to argue, dehumanizes both itself and others. And I'm borrowing that term from Aimé Césaire in his writings on colonialism. In the case of whiteness, we see this everywhere around us because whiteness is represented to us as the Greek god or goddess sometimes, the monument, other than human, more than human, divine. And it represents others then as less than human or not fully human. It's going to require what Stuart called a profound cultural transformation to, as it were, undehumanize whiteness and imagine another kind of future. So I want to begin by thinking in the space that Cedric Robinson asked us to think of the Renaissance and think about how white space was formed during that period. This is a painting that'll be familiar to anybody that's taken an undergraduate art history survey. It's usually used to teach the operations of perspective, which are clearly visible in this painting. It depicts an ideal city. But I want to say also that this ideal city is also a space of ideal whiteness, and it is the space in which racial capitalism takes place. In the background, these buildings here are warehouses through which the Renaissance city-state will first create an internal form of capitalism and then, as we'll see in a moment, become colonial. And it marks that space with monumental statues around and in the edge of this defining space. And I want to create a fold here between this painting and its depiction in the film Baltimore by Isaac Julian that was made in 2003, but Julian rescreened it for people during the pandemic shutdown. And Julian will also be appearing in the abolition series I mentioned. So what you're seeing here is a still that I made showing the African-American film director Marvin Van Peebles, who made the various blaxploitation movies during the 1970s, looking at that same painting I showed you a moment ago in the Waters Art Gallery in Baltimore, where it's now housed. And clearly Van Peebles' interrogation is there a space for me within this ideal city, or am I somehow excluded from it by virtue of my ethnicity and identification? So that fold runs to me throughout the defining of the ideal city as a city which is always and already white, always and already located in the heart of Europe. In this project, in this forging of a white city space, there is a kind of triangulation at work that remains active today. The triangulation between the eradication of the indigenous, settler colonialism, and Atlantic slavery. And here I will just simply indicate to you by visual bullet points how that operated in Renaissance Florence. The Florentine Codex that I'm showing you here was made by Bernardino de Sahagún using Nahua students in early colonial Mexico to depict the universal history of the things of New Spain, as it was titled. And that manuscript is then taken from Mexico, brought to Florence by Fernandino de' Medici, who became the Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1588. And indeed, it remains in Florence to the present day. So that's one, indigenous eradication. Two, settler colonialism. This famous print that, again, I think many of us will know, there's a version in the Metropolitan Museum, for example, here in New York City, where I am now, depicts the discovery of America. It was made by a man who has multiple names, but here we're going to give him his Italian name because that's where he was when he made it, Stradano. And it depicts the taking of America as a form of possession, which is also sexualized, or more explicitly is conceived of in terms of sexual assault and sexual violence. In the background, the justification for all this, the purported cannibalism of the indigenous population of the Americas. This work was made by Giovanni Stradano in Florence, where he was a court artist and designed engravings representing the discovery of the Americas at that time. And third, and as we know, the project of Atlantic settler colonialism that was launched from Italy at this time by Fernandino de' Medici, who set out to create a colony for Tuscany in the Americas using British pirates who he sent to what he thought was Brazil, but it actually turned out to be what we now know to be, what we now call French Guiana. The project failed, but he was actively engaged in it and created a statue of himself looking out to sea in the coastal town of Livorno and holding here the baton of his authority, which depicts him as a ruler. And we'll come back to this on numerous occasions. This statue was made around the turn of the 17th century in 1602. And what happens at this point is a transformation of sculpture. We know this through the sculpture of the Italian artist Bernini, who metamorphoses and transforms violence into value. And he uses this famous example from the work of Ovid to depict that. Here, Apollo, again, sexual violence in action. He's chasing Daphne, who has no interest in him and asks to be turned into a tree, which you can see happening here. Apollo, nonetheless, pursues his assault of her as a tree and then turns it into a laurel tree. So whenever we say someone has won their laurels, or when we literally crown someone with a laurel wreath, we are continuing to enact this process. The sculpture itself turns material stone into an object of great and high cultural value. So it represents, it depicts within itself the process of racial capital, the means by which the use of violence creates value, particularly, of course, the violence directed at the enslaved. And The figure of Apollo and later the figure of Adam alternate as the symbol for humanity and a fallen humanity, one that produces what Fanon called the Manichaean order of coloniality. And what he means by this is that after the fall of man, as described in Genesis, that things are either good or evil. There's no middle ground between them. So the sculpture that I showed you before gets an addition. These sculptures, called the Moors, that were added in 1626, made by the sculptor Pietro Tacca. They're called the Moors, and they depict North African and sub-Saharan Africans who were enslaved and held in the city of Livorno. At this time, about 8% of Livorno's population were enslaved, and they lived in a particular building called the Bagno, or the bath, which is to say there was then a carceral geography within the Renaissance city-state. In The Ideal City, a text by Giovanni Vasari, who was the nephew of the art historian Vasari, he noted these slave prisons as part of his ideal city. These sculptures were actually made from the life. We know who their models were, their life casts. On the left, as you're looking at here, is a man called Ali, who is Muslim from North Africa. And on the right, a man called Morgiano, who's sub-Saharan African. So what I want us to do is to think of every monument that we see, every statue that celebrates a white colonial figure, as having conceptually statues of the enslaved attached to its base. Sometimes they're there, usually not, but conceptually they're always present, it seems to me. That this is then the formation of white space and white seeing in the early Renaissance. City space then metamorphosed in the collective view that you see here of the statue as white space. And of course, the statue is still there. It's still present. And there are ongoing debates about the presence of African migrants in Italy today. So in the second part of this, I want to think about whiteness as what's called constituent power. So literally, that's the power to make a constitution, often celebrated in the United States as the founding fathers, who were almost all slave owners. For Negri, Antonio Negri describes modernity as being characterized by a play between that power, the power to make a constitution, and its constituted power. In other words, once you have a constitution, you can do things according to it. It has power. But as David Graeber used to point out before his recent death, everything that you do to make a constitution is illegal until you establish it. So that when the founding fathers revolted against the British state, they were legally traitors at that point, right up until the moment that they established a constitution. So what Graeber asked us to do was to fold against this idea of constituent power, the constituent power of our imaginations. And what I'm asking us to do is to think of constituent power as the constituent power of whiteness within the regime of racial capital. That it is not then, as Negri and other writers have sometimes tried to claim, something of a mystery or an ineffable thing, that somehow power has its force, that it is connected directly to the practice of settler colonialism and white supremacy. And this diagram, again, I think this will be very familiar to anyone that's read any of the standard visual culture textbooks, to me exemplifies that. The power of white seeing by erasing, it's a drawing made by a man called Abraham Boss, of perspective. But I think it shows us much more than that. The white man here stands with his head tilted down, 4 strings to his eye in perfect straight lines. These strings demarcate a space on the ground. Together, they make a pyramid, which is said to be vision. But I want you to consider instead the white space in between the lines. It's not a passive way of seeing as observation, but an active technique of separation, erasure, and definition. In short, colonizing. And actually, although this image shows no bodily harm, it's about as violent an image as I can imagine. It visualizes the process by which European colonizers designated territory as, in Latin, terra nullius, that is to say, literally nothing land. And that's what you're seeing here, nothing land. There's no one there by definition, because any persons have been erased by the process of taking possession. So this space is erased rather than empty. It's the site of an operation to erase life in order to extract value. The erased space is the white spatial imaginary. And I want you to also notice the little numbers around the edge, letters, excuse me, around the edge of the white space that demarcates the space as calculable data. White space is measurable, it's quantifiable, and therefore real. And it was known in the period and today as real estate. The real is royal, meaning sovereign, and above all, it's white, literally white, unimpeded by any shadow or reflection, erased, or that might be caused, excuse me, by the strong light source coming in from outside the frame. So whiteness is not subject to the laws of opticality, nor is white seeing. This isn't about vision. It's about a process through which whiteness is constituted as sovereign power. And I want to create a fold here for you. It's a diagram depicting how a drone operates. It was made by the Israeli Defense Force in 1982. And you can see that this is, to all intents and purposes, precisely the same visual diagram. The drone here sees spaces on the ground. Those spaces are now known to the military as kill boxes, because, as you might imagine from the name, if you can be seen within the kill box, you may be killed. We have the expression, if looks could kill, they can now, and they do on a fairly regular basis. But this is simply the automation and the mechanization of the white seeing that was understood as integral to the process of settler colonialism since the 17th century, and has now just become militarized. There is indeed, the United States Army has an entire manual on the kill box. You have to fill out a form. There's a whole bureaucracy of the kill box. You can download this if you're interested. So to go back to my 17th century example, this kind of white seeing was put into practice on the plantation by the overseer in English and in a couple of other languages. That name itself makes the pun in the name, overseeing, makes that very clear. The violence is implied here by the presence of this big stick, but the functions of settler colonialism are said to be natural and functional without the necessity for that violence. There's a visual rhyme here between the overseer and the sovereign, as here Charles I by Van Dyck. See him standing in the same pose with that same stick. That's the same stick that Ferdinando de' Medici was carrying. Notice too the ships in the ocean, if you can see those there, that we'll come back to in just a moment. Kingship is then surrogated into the form of the state as a statue, and it acquires the name Leviathan under the philosopher Thomas Hobbes in 1651. So what Leviathan does is it claims the monopoly of violence that the state then and now claims that it is the only agent able to carry out violence in order to create colonial value. Leviathan was itself a counter response to the English Revolution. During the English Revolution, radicals like the Levelers and the Diggers claimed that the fall of man, Genesis, and the creation of the Manichaean relation of good and evil was in fact the creation of private property. And their goal was, to use the phrase of the British historian Christopher Hill, to get back behind the fall. So it's both a spatial and a temporal move at once, to get back behind time space. And when you're behind the fall, it's no longer permissible to have slavery. Christian theology said that it was only because of the fall that you could have enslavement. If you were back behind the fall, slavery then would be theologically immoral and illegal. Leviathan, though, is a colonial force. And here's a detail of that diagram made by the same artist, Abraham Boss, who I showed you a moment ago drawing white scene. And this is a colonial view. I'll just show you two details here. This is on the far right-hand side of the image. You can see the ships in the water again, as in the Van Dyke here and here, and a fort that indicates that this land is being occupied militarily by Leviathan. Leviathan is also in the water. If you notice, here's the sea level. Here's Leviathan's waist. That indicates to us that half of Leviathan is below the water. And I'll come back to that in a moment. In the text, Hobbes tells us that all of us are fixing our gaze on Leviathan because in exchange for his keeping us safe, we owe him a duty of respect and following. If we look in the detail, again, we'll see that's not quite true. There are some figures who are looking away. And Abraham Bosse, who had revolted against the French monarchy himself, perhaps included this little detail as just a possibility of revolt, the possibility of an alternative way of doing business. But I want to say also that they are all white. And in 17th century Britain, that was absolutely not the case. Queen Elizabeth wrote a number of letters protesting at the number of what she called blackamoors, meaning people of African descent, in London. And of course, Shakespeare wrote about them in his plays like Othello. So it was not the case that all citizens were white in 17th century Europe, but Leviathan depicts them as if they were white. So then I want us to think of Leviathan as a ship. That those who are below the water, in the way that I showed you a moment ago, are, as it were, becoming black. People do not think of themselves as black when they are in Africa. They think of themselves as Igbo or Congo or Yoruba, any of the other nations of Africa. They are becoming black. Those above the waterline then are becoming white and are learning to think of themselves as having constituent power because of their whiteness. And that is to say then that Leviathan is, to all intents and purposes, a platform of whiteness and a slave ship. The slave ship is then a metaphor for the ship of state and vice versa. When we look at the famous diagram of a slave ship called HMS Brooks that was made in 1788, I'm showing you a detail here to show you that what's often said is that all the enslaved were depicted as abstract figures in the same way that we are told that the figures in Leviathan were all turned towards the figure of the state. Again, you can see that that's not true here, that the depicted Africans on their way to becoming enslaved are depicted very much as individuals. And through the figure of the slave ship, we can then begin to think about how whiteness creates a platform for its seeing. I'm showing you here, as you probably expected that I would, Turner's famous painting called Slavers. And I'm showing you to here in a version of photograph that I took myself, just to indicate to you, this is actually quite a small painting. It's almost square. It was designed to be in someone's house, as we'll hear in a moment, not to be a grand full-scale history painting. So when I show it to you like this, in a PowerPoint format, it looks much bigger somehow, doesn't it? And much larger and stretched. In Christina Sharp's important analysis of this painting, she has pointed out that Turner's slave ship lacks a proper name, which allows it then to stand in for any slave ship, whatever. And I want us to call our attention to the formal title of this painting, Slavers Throwing Overboard, the Dead and Dying, Typhon Coming On. Now, it's not then called the slave ship, as you often see it referred to. And slavers refers to both the white crew who operate the ship and to the generic class of slave ships, which were also known as slavers. From where in this image then would the slavers, the white crew, be looking? They would have a position on the quarterdeck, which is the back of the main deck, as it's known, on the slave ship here, that will be separated from the enslaved by a barricade known as the barricado to the slavers. It is placed high in the picture, if you like. It's single jib on the ship, the sail here, at the front of the ship is being ripped by the wind. And it is then their sole place from which to see. They're framed against the purples and oranges of the setting sun, the Manichaean condition of enslavement. Now, the typhon is not, as people often say, a typhoon, which is firstly a different word. Secondly, is a storm that refers to a hurricane that takes place in the Pacific, as Turner, who was well versed in the mechanics of seafaring, would have known. And thirdly, was a word that was not used in English until much after this painting. Typhon was an ancient Greek deity who existed in the regime of chaos that exists in between the creation of heaven and hell after Satan's expulsion, but before the fall of man. And Turner knew this very well because he taught Paradise Lost, Milton's poem, in his classes at the Academy in Britain. So the sea, this stormy sea that we see here, is in one sense Milton's chaos, the zone between heaven, hell, and earth, chaos that precedes the fall. So the slavers here are a paradox. And Turner was not a political artist in many ways, but this painting fits in with the other work that he did around this time that depicted the flood and the creation. So it's him meditating on the very possibilities of light and seeing from the perspective of whiteness. We should be cautious about attributing abolitionist views to Turner, who had invested in 1805 in a business that generated its revenue from slavery in Jamaica. The poem that he attached to this painting says, is called Hope, Fallacious Hope. And one of its choruses is, Hope, where is thy market now? Now, what does that entirely mean? Does it mean that the market created by transatlantic slavery has collapsed? It's obviously ambivalent. None of this denies the possibility of reading this painting from the abolitionist perspective, but we want to be careful about ascribing that intent to the white artist. What I think this work does is it thinks about how slavery was only permissible after the fall. It thinks about how abolition in the 1830s had come to name slavery as America's original sin, a term that you'll still hear sometimes. Obama used it just the other day. Forgetting, of course, the displacement and genocide of the indigenous in the Americas. This seeing is through pigeonholes, a term that could equally refer to a small hole for a person's hands that were restrained during flogging, a little hole in a ship through which rigging would pass, or later a double space on the printed page. In other words, the whole white world is in the pigeonhole. The slaver did and could come on land. Like Leviathan, the slaver is an amphibian, by nature a sea monster, but capable of thriving on land. The dominant way of seeing is the way of seeing from the deck, but it is the view of racializing surveillance capitalism. Now, the critic John Ruskin bought this painting and owned it for many years. He hanged it in his living room, incredibly enough. Eat his dinner in front of this painting, which is hard to imagine. And from it, I think he learned how to create an imperial aesthetic. He still owned it when he gave a series of lectures on art at Oxford University in 1871, during which he imagined that the child of the educated race, meaning white people, has an innate instinct for beauty. Consequently, he argued, this is what England must do, or perish. She must found colonies as fast and far as she is able, on every patch of fruitful waste ground, that is to say, terra nullius, that she can set her foot on. Now, Ruskin was taught to scholars and artists and art historians, and continues to be taught through to the present moment. I want to take a jump here to thinking about how this form of imperialism survived decolonization. Did it then indeed perish in the moment of decolonization when Britain lost its colonies in the period immediately following the Second World War? And how then did ways of seeing come into being at exactly that time? Now, you'll be familiar with this term from the critic John Berger. But I'm actually going to argue that it was an interface between London and Barbados and Notting Hill and the ICA, which is the Institute for Contemporary Art. In the 1950s, John Berger was actually thinking about Ruskin when he wrote as a young art critic that what was needed was, quote, the vision of a new state. He did, although he was using the idea of way of seeing at the time in throw-off conversational form, he didn't theorize it. The person who did was the man on the left-hand side of the slide that I'm showing you here, the Barbadian poet and writer George Lamming, who was in dialogue with the Trinidadian theorist C.L.R. James, who's one of the subjects of Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, which re-enters our discussion here. Lamming comes to this understanding through an encounter at the Institute of Contemporary Art, London, where he was asked to read a poem. And as he walks up to the lectern to do that, he was greeted with what he describes as an extraordinary wave of applause. And he understood that that meant that he had been seen as someone from the African diaspora, and that nothing else was expected of him other than to appear. The poet who was next up was the man I'm showing you on the right, Emanuel Litvinov, who was an East End Jewish radical and a poet. And he was brought in there very much to show that the new white working class were capable of high culture. But what Lamming did was something that disrupted that whole event. He read this poem, which is called To T.S. Eliot, and it's an indictment of Eliot's anti-Semitism. The problem for Litvinov and for the event as a whole was that Eliot was actually in the room at the time. And the whole room explodes as soon as Litvinov reads this poem, and Stephen Spender jumps up, who's another British poet, and starts accusing Litvinov of not understanding Eliot's work. And at this moment, then Lamming, who's in the audience watching this happen, understands what a way of seeing is. And he understands it as a proximity to what he calls Notting Hill, which is not the gentrified part of London that we know today, but the place in which West Indian and Caribbean migrants had arrived in London and were living. And at the time that Lamming was writing his text in 1960, had been the subject of racialized violence in 1958 and 1959. So for Lamming, the ICA was a neighbor of Notting Hill. That's not geographically correct, but it's correct in the sense that he understands the way of seeing to be a violent one. He described it as, you are the other according to your way of seeing me in relation to yourself. He then sees Litvinov being seen, being racialized by the white audience, and understands that it equally applies to him as a Caribbean migrant, and understands that it is a violent form of separation that is being performed in that space. Notting Hill at the time was described by sociologist Ruth Glass as a hybrid zone between the colonizer and the colonized in London. A zone of transition, as she wrote, marked by, quote, visual diversity. Now we know what that means from fan art. It means differentiated skin tone. In his account of the racialized violence, Stuart Hall, who was active in Notting Hill as a young activist at the time, took his findings 2 steps further. Firstly, he asserted bluntly that Notting Hill is London. That is to say, there was no distinction to be made between the particular zone in which the majority of Caribbean migrants lived and the city as a whole, that the whole city was a space of racialized violence. These structuring prejudices were then constituent of what he called the unmistakable profile of Britain's colonial policy over the last century. Now, if you think when he's writing that in 1958, he's tracking it back to the first Indian War of Independence in 1857. The British call this the Indian Mutiny, and then through a variety of colonial uprisings, some of which were continuing at the time that Hall was writing in Kenya, Malaya, and elsewhere. Now, with others, Hall undertook a collective critical and activist response to the anti-colonial understanding of Notting Hill as London, first by the form of Direct Action and elsewhere. And he used photographs in the journal that he edited called Universities and Left Review, that became the New Left Review shortly afterwards. They were taken by his friend Roger Main, who had been at Oxford with him, on a particular street called Southam Street, one of the most impoverished neighborhoods in an already poor region of London, the street on which Kelso Cochrane from Antigua was killed in 1959, and a street on which Oswald Mosley, the former fascist and leader of the so-called Union movement, the reformed fascist movement of Britain, held rallies in the late 50s. The Victoria and Albert Museum at this time in Britain didn't recognize photography as an art form at all, but Main thought of himself as an artist, had an exhibition in the same Institute of Contemporary Art where Lamming and Litvinov had generated their way of seeing, and began this photographic project. Main's work can be understood as exemplifying Stewart's foundational insight that race is the modality in which class is lived, and it is the medium in which class relations are experienced. In these photographs, we don't see the invented tradition of the 19th century working class, the flat caps, football, pubs, any of that. What we see are the English, Welsh, and Scottish who live in Notting Hill coming to see themselves exclusively in terms of whiteness as a form of national belonging and separating themselves from their Caribbean counterparts. Hall himself wrote later that he understood himself to be black for the first time when he lived in London. Up until that point, he had identified himself as colored. And the intersection of these processes is precisely the making of life in a context of post-war austerity, transitioning to a consumer society. Here's one of Main's photographs showing you Southam Street. And here you see four smartly dressed West Indian men moving through the street. The format, the landscape format, evokes the atmosphere and beauty that Main thought he could find in these urban spaces, but it also, to me, brings Ruskin back to mind and the imperial landscape. All kinds of ways of seeing are going on here, as you can see. On the one hand, the four children are frankly staring at the Caribbean men, enacting Fanon's look, a Negro, absolutely directly. The three of the West Indian men are looking directly ahead of them, checking out for any form of potential trouble and keeping their eyes about them. On the far left-hand side of the photograph, as you look at it, you'll see a group of young white British men studiously avoiding that glance. And the British politician Alan Johnson, who grew up on this street, in his autobiography, he describes how you needed to be what he called hard, and that manifested itself through the look. And the particular way that they described that was, if I catch you looking at me, I need to say back to you, oi, who you screwing? And screwing was a word that had the connotation of looking, but it obviously also has the sexualized and violent connotation too. So these young men are carefully avoiding having to engage in that encounter. And the one man on the right, far right-hand side, the fourth Caribbean man, identifying Main, photographing him, but also, of course, positioning us as spectators to this scene. Now, all the accounts of racialized violence in Notting Hill take cross-ethnic relationships to be causal, that looking for trouble is how that comes about. And the riots began because young white people took themselves to Notting Hill and saw a white woman who they understood to be in a relationship with a Caribbean man. There is then, this photograph then captures, I think, this transition of racialization, producing and produced by a modality of class relations as a way of life in the domain of Notting Hill. Now, I realize I'm running short on time, so I'm going to now just talk through my remaining images to not take up the whole evening here. Here's another photograph that shows you these ways of seeing taking place on Southam Street. Two young Caribbean boys, one looking off, knowing that he's being supervised, two children engaging each other, a kind of interestingly open space, intersected by the kind of gaze that you're seeing from the edge of the street as photographed here by Maine again. What I want us to notice is there's no threat in these images, that people are watching out for each other, that people are looking at each other, but it's not surveillance, it's care. It becomes surveillance, it becomes self-surveillance when the threat of white violence intrudes, as here, the TEDs, as they call themselves, marching down and occupying the whole space of the street, and this young man carrying a stick so as to challenge. In other words, it's hard white masculinity that creates the condition of violence. It was known to people at the time. The Australian queer novelist Colin McInnes wrote a novel called Absolute Beginners, which had a photograph by Colin Maine on the front cover. McInnes also wrote for Stuart Hall's journal, Universities and Left Review. And he describes in the novel what happened when the racialized violence begins. And this is the quotation on the left. There you could feel a hole, as if some kind of life were draining out of it, leaning behind it a sort of vacuum. And it is then that way of life that was being constituted on a street like Southam Street that drains away when racialized violence intrudes into that space, creating a hole that we can identify and then work with. That's what's happening, I think, with the war on statues that we are now engaged in. That by removing statues, we create holes through which white supremacy can be seen. This is a decolonial war. It began in Algeria in the 1960s. This is the statue of the colonist, the Duc d'Orléans, tagged and removed on the first day of Algerian independence by revolutionaries, a movement that spread south throughout Africa, reaches Luanda in 1975. Here the artist Kilanjui Kiahenda plays with that project. The statues were actually removed while the decolonial fighting was going on in 1975, but it's now been subsumed by the oil wealth of extraction that the glass tower in the background depicts. This reaches South Africa at the end of the apartheid period, and the point at which the born free generation give up on the hope of emancipation and take it into their own hands by a bringing together of the world of the dispossessed and the world of white statuary. Here, Chimani Maxwell, the performer, is throwing human excrement collected in the townships onto the statue of Cecil John Rhodes, which led to the removal of that statue less than a month later. This is where Rhodes was. And you can see him looking out over the Cape Town area, that white scene creating white space, and activists painted in his former shadow on the steps. That movement, of course, has come to the United States, and it came through the South African activist Zanele Moholy, who had an exhibition in Charlottesville, Virginia in June of 2015. And they took their self-portrait there. This is called Bona, which in Xhosa and Zulu means they, which is Moholy's preferred pronoun. So it's an interesting question to think what the selfie becomes when your pronoun is they, them. And Moholy was exploring that here in a situation where, knowing that she was being looked at primarily by a white audience, they have blackened themselves beyond their normal skin tone so as to call out the tension between the whitened cotton on which they are lying, the mirror in which they are looking, and their own body. The day that this photograph was taken was the day that they gave a lecture at their own exhibit on visual activism and recounted the story of Roseman's Fall, which had just taken place. 2 weeks later, activists in Charlottesville tagged the statue of Robert E. Lee, Black Lives Matter, which was then removed. That set in process the whole Charlottesville situation, where the city voted to remove the statue, leading to the far-right rally in Charlottesville in 2017, and to the condition that statues are now an election issue in 2020. That, I think, is a condition that's more familiar to you. So I have not deeply illustrated it. Here's the Charlottesville statue. We just see the tag on the bottom there, even though they whited it out. But this is what happens when you remove the statues. You create a fold back to Notting Hill and the way of seeing. You create a hole in white space. This is where Robert E. Lee had stood in New Orleans, Louisiana, before activists removed that statue in 2017. We have created many more such holes. My question for us tonight then, to conclude, is how many nodes in the network do we have to disable, as it were, or take out before it fails? How many holes do we have to create before the network itself collapses? And I'll leave you with this last image that was made by Liberate Tate from one of my previous talks. I want an institution, gallery, museum, whatever, that doesn't represent white supremacy, that doesn't represent a prison, in which there isn't expropriated labor, there isn't extraction, and there isn't genocide. What would that look like? Thank you for patiently listening to me. I hope that there are some of you still out there, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you now.
Thank you so much, Nick. And as we give Aria an opportunity to join us, let's all sort of thank you so much for the presentation. And also, I'll note to everybody that Aria is going to have a solo show titled Sweet at Red Cat, the space hosted also with CalArts in downtown Los Angeles this winter from January 16th to April 11th. So we're looking forward to having Aria join us in so many different capacities here at CalArts. And here's Aria.
Hi. Everyone else is muted for some reason. I don't know why that is.
Oh, we're here. So feel free to kick off the response any way you'd like.
Okay, well, thank you so much. That was really interesting, and it really was so like resonant with so many things that I've been thinking about in my own work recently, and I guess over the years, and been interestingly like coming at it from similar and using similar texts and also different ones and coming at it from sort of different angle. And where you left it off actually was like very much what I was hoping to get to talk a bit more about, which was sort of, I guess, the question of, starting from the question of the monument and, which obviously is what, you're speaking about for the most part, and really delving into the question of representation, because I think for me, what I've been really like looking at in my work has been like, I guess, the role of representational framework as a way of thinking, stretching back as far as, the Greeks as a, obviously super determinant element of like Western thought, such that this like white way of seeing is so reliant on the very concept of representation. And of course, monuments then become this like very, like, it's like a crystallization of that whole mode. And so I guess like, my general thoughts, and then I have some questions maybe we can talk about, but I also been reading a lot of Akili Mbembe recently, and there's this really great section in Critique of Black Reason, which I pulled out, but where he just talks about Blackness being the colossus of the world, and this idea that basically, I was like, quote it, but basically he says, the Black man serves as the colossus of our world to the extent that our world can be understood as a giant tomb or cave. In this immense and empty tomb, to say Black is to evoke the absent corpses for which the name is a substitute. Each time we invoke the word Black, we bring out into the light of day all the waste of the world, the excess whose absence within the tomb is as strange as is terrifying. As the colossus of the world, the Black man is the fire that illuminates the things of the cave. So kind of like, he was kind of recalling the Plato's cave thing that we often gets, invoked to just generally talk about representation. And I think it's like interesting, and I mean, not to just go, all the way into just this book in particular, but it is a good entry point, I think, for, I guess, in terms of what I was thinking a lot while you're talking was this idea of like, sort of like white regime of the visible or ways of seeing, the role of like fantasy in that as well, and the imaginary, that like there's this necessary element of that sort of requires like an originary like imagination almost to even begin to fashion that as a paradigm. And so that was something that I really that I started thinking about a lot. And then of course, like the many paradoxes that arise from, or the role of Blackness in that being this very paradoxical one, of course, where it's like, as you know, even as you know, you're talking about the sort of like hyper visible, but then also, you know, in the shadows, and also like presenting an apparent and like ongoing disunity that like, oh, this white way of seeing can't really make sense of in many ways as well. But anyway, that was like kind of my general, like those are my general thoughts. I guess something that starting with the monument thing, a question for you would be thinking about, yeah, so maybe we can just keep going on that sort of network and the holes in the network thing. Like, do you think, so I mean, the thing that came up for me with that was, yeah, like you can continue to like poke these holes, but then also do you have to fill those holes with something else, you know, and like, how do you, because yeah, it's like one thing to deconstruct this like particular regime of representation or, you know, monumentality and the where that's coming from, you know, in terms of the violence that births it. But then, yeah, like, is it like, then we like replace, you know, I think there's a lot of conversation around that. Like, do we replace those monuments with like ones to like Black history figures or, you know, post-colonial and all these things? So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you, Aria. And I think we need to probably continue this conversation after tonight because it sounds like we have much in common. I just want to, you know, just quickly footnote that the whole point of this project is for me not to talk about Blackness. I don't think it's my place to talk about Blackness. I think that's what the movement is saying to us, saying, white people, you folks need to sort out your own histories. And what I'm trying to do then is to follow in the footsteps of someone like Cedric Robinson and say, well, what would that mean, right? And I think what Robinson says to us is you really need to look at this in the long frame. Don't just talk about the last 10 weeks. I mean, if you look at Black Marxism, he doesn't really get, the last figure is Richard Wright. I mean, he didn't even talk about the civil rights movement in any specific depth. And so that's kind of the backdrop to this. To answer your question directly, I think this is the current question. I mean, there's no question about it. When you take these things down, there is this interestingly charged moment where this is whole. And so what we've seen in the last week, actually, is white liberalism going, oh my God, look, there's this hole in the fabric of American white seeing and white space. Let's put $250 million into thinking about what ought to go there instead, which is to say the Mellon Foundation has put up all this money. Now, its intentions, I'm sure, are probably very good in some ways, but I'm also sure that there's this anxiety about this space. You know, what histories will be told? How will children know this and know that? There are things called books. That's how we teach people history, right? You don't have to make a child, as they walk up to the American Museum of Natural History, which is a museum that's aimed at children, feel their subjectification because of that Roosevelt statue. And actually, they don't do that through racial theory. This Titus Kaphar pointed this out, and it's also in the show that the American Museum put on themselves. Children look at that and they think it's unfair because they see the white man on the horse and the other two supposed African caricature and the Plains Indian caricature without horses. They recognize what's being shown to them is unfairness. And I've come to think of school actually as an apparatus by which people are taught how to tolerate the unfair, to tolerate hierarchy, to tolerate difference, unjustified difference, right? So your question, what do we do instead? I mean, this is the key question. What cues do we learn? If we look to the South African movement, and I was thinking about this because you mentioned Ashia Bembe. Bembe was a strong supporter of Rhodes Must Fall, but he was not a supporter of Fees Must Fall. He was actually quite critical of them. And particularly an incident that took place when young South African activists went into a dining hall at the University of Cape Town and took a bunch of fairly mediocre colonial era paintings off the wall, and they took them outside and they set fire to them. Now, instantly, everybody in South Africa, at least white opinion with some allies, was united in opposition to Fees Must Fall. And I think the same would happen were activists to do the same thing here, were we to. And yet the same people are endlessly talking about James Baldwin, who is now a secular saint. Baldwin's book was called The Fire Next Time, right? So which fire are we waiting for here? And at what point do we take these steps? So and I'm engaged with a group of artists and activists to try and think about this question. What we're coming up with is what we're calling living monuments that will be ephemeral, that won't last, some of which will need to do the work that I think needs to be done of addressing directly the legacies of white supremacy. So there's one thing, if we take these monuments down, the supposed worry for people who've been perfectly fine with it for the last 100 or so years is that somehow people won't learn the history of white supremacy. I mean, I'm not that worried about that, but I am worried or engaged in making visible some of those practices, so that in New York City, for example, where I am now, the practices of the draft riots of 1863, where a substantial portion of existing free Black culture was burned and people were lynched, and that's not memorialized, that's not memorized. Washington Square Park, just a stone's throw from where I am now. In the 17th century, the Dutch called that land of the blacks. That's not a positive term, but it tells you something important about the history, that was land that was farmed by half-free, which is a Dutch term, Africans, that sustained and made possible the white settlement downtown. So the fact that there is something called New York and that there was something called New Amsterdam, it's only possible because of the labor that took place over there. And yet when I walk around Washington Square, I see a huge monument to a slave owner, George Washington, but I don't see any indication at all of African-American life. Now that's, my ephemeral monument doesn't need to address that. It does need to call out those white supremacy practices that are ongoing in my space. And I think what we need is what's beginning to happen in a conversation like this, what the UCSC Visualizing Abolition Project is doing is collective practice, right? I mean, abolition is a collective work. It's a huge labor, as Ruthie Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis and so many other Black feminists have told us for so many years, which will, as Ruth Gilmore tells us, change everything. So it will not be the work of any individual or set of individuals, but a collective labor in which we all engage. And finally, then it will move us into a state in which representation is not exclusively tied to whiteness.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think I've actually been like working on, was asked to do like a proposal for a new monument for like in Sweden somewhere that was like memorializing, like it's basically like a plot of land, that the French traded the Swedish for ownership of like St. Bart's. So the French then got this free port in Sweden. And then of course, Sweden was imbricated in the slave trade through this like, one like transaction basically, but then, and then also like that, all this like difference or like, yeah, it's weird Swedish, like, history of slavery. And it's really interesting. Something else that I've been thinking a lot about is just, the sort of, like even with the thing with like, Washington Square Park, the fact that like, there's this like material history to the role that like material and economic history to the role that Black or African people in like the early years of like New York, let's say, as a whatever, like city, as a colony, etc., had. And so like the sort of weird, I think part of something else that's interesting with this monument conversation is the slippage between, and I guess also in terms of thinking about collectivity and abolition, the slippage between the sort of, the way that monuments, generally speaking, represent an individual or a group of individuals who either are actual individuals or stand in for a larger body, such that there's like this, representational like alchemy that happens when really what we're talking about are like truly material and economic histories that then of course are like lived through the experience of individuals. So I've been really interested in thinking about, and I guess also this goes with some of the work that I've been doing around like the position of Blackness in relationship to the symbolic and to the material and those sort of problems that like, for instance, with the Breonna Taylor like magazine cover thing, where everyone's like, okay, this is like some sort of symbolic justice where like not suddenly her image is circulating and we're talking about it, but of course the material justice of, like, but also is indicting the person who killed her actually fully reparative, or is it's within the judicial system anyway. But like, but then the debate around what a symbol does, in terms of conversation around white supremacy or around like anti-Blackness and, actual material, like reparative action or like, abolitionist action. So that's something else that's been really interesting. And I guess that also leads me to think about, I was curious also if you have thoughts on, it just kind of came up to me, like the sort of language of the aesthetics of respect. Then I was sort of thinking about how like semiotics isn't necessarily immediately inserted into the conversation, and sort of wondered what you thought about like the difference between talking about a semiotics of like a white way of seeing or a white way of talking about the vision, and then an aesthetic of that. Yeah.
Again, thank you. Those are really insightful comments. And I have so much I could say. I wanted to very interested in your conversation about reparations. I have a new 3 R's, which is removal, restitution, and reparations. These are the 3 R's of, you know, undoing the whiteout that I'm talking about. So we're at the stage of removal, great, but that's literally the foot in the door. You know, when the American Museum of Natural History kind of first said, well, you can't take away our statue because it implicates the rest of the museum. Yeah, hell yeah. So what about all the human remains inside the American Museum of Natural History, or indeed the Metropolitan Museum or the British Museum, where they're cozily known as mummies, but those are human remains. They were buried in ritualistic circumstances and designed to remain out of sight for eternity. What would we think if a group of North Africans went and dug up Charlemagne and put him on public display, which is the equivalent? We know what we were thinking. We think it would be considered appalling. So restitution, cultural property, human remains, all of that. I don't care if the museums end up empty, although they won't. I mean, we've seen what happened with NAGPRA, which is the North American Graves Repatriation Act. A small amount of Native American objects and human remains has been returned. It's a difficult, it's a cumbersome process. We need to loosen that up and move it quickly. And then reparations. And reparations will be a process by which, as you know, Grace Lee Boggs used to say, some of us must live more simply so that others can simply live. That must now happen. And that is, under the climate change circumstances in which we live, we have literally no alternative but to which to do that. Your point about semiotics is an interesting one, and there's much to say there too. One of the ways that I could speak to this would be to think about, in the British Museum, in the front of the British Museum, they have a thing they call the Enlightenment Gallery. And in that Enlightenment Gallery, they have a shield that was taken from an Aboriginal person who the British Marines shot and killed when Captain Cook landed. And it's called the Guigal Shield. And it has a hole in the middle of the shield showing exactly where the bullet struck, although the British Museum extraordinarily tries to deny that that's what it obviously is. Now, you know very well, because you're a scholar of semiotics, that Charles Sanders Peirce argued that the index was the bullet hole. So there are bullet holes all over our museums. The Benin so-called bronzes visibly display the marks of the violence that caused them to be removed from the Benin, in 1897 on the punitive expedition, and so on. And so that it's not, I don't want to create an impression that I think that the aesthetics that I described tonight supplant or displace semiotics. Actually, to the contrary, and the semiotics of the violent and depressing semiotics of the skull shape and the length of the forehead and all of those racialized signifiers, which are abundantly present in every statue that we see, but also in our language. So that you may not recognize when you look at the Roosevelt statue that it's a eugenic statue, but it is. But you will recognize the word highbrow when you hear it, which is also a eugenic term, and its counterpoints lowbrow and middlebrow. Those are eugenic terms. Or when you describe, as people sometimes do, a bad idea as Neanderthal, again, you're thinking about racialized hierarchy over time. So I'm only just essentially endorsing and backing up your point, which is absolutely, it's a collaborative. I ran out of time as it was. As you saw, this is a new talk and I haven't quite learned how to pace it yet. And I get caught up in my own interest in the thing. But again, thank you for those thoughts.
Yeah. I also wondered, I guess, then from what you're saying about the language thing is interesting in terms of like eugenic language. And I wonder, I mean, I think something that's interesting, you know, there's so many conversations around, you know, there's a monument conversation. There's also, of course, so many conversations about language and, you know, what kind of languages, you know, yeah, we both know. But I think, I wonder, like with that, like, you know, with things like highbrow, which is so, you know, dispersed into culture, do you imagine on the level of language a similar project, like, there's like, let's say those 3 R's or some sort of, correlative project happening on the level of language, where we're not talking about objects that we physically remove, but things that travel through culture in a sort of, diffuse way?
That's a really interesting idea. I hadn't thought of that, but I love it. I love that idea. And I think, I'm old enough to remember when there was this huge argument about if you said he or she instead of he, you would somehow debase the English language. All its beauty would disappear. And no poetry would ever be possible ever again. You could write poems after Auschwitz, apparently, but if you put he or she, oh my God, it's all over. Well, we've got past that, thank God. And we managed to find a situation where, at least in some circles, people can address themselves by whatever pronoun they choose to be addressed. Good. But again, we only have our foot in the door, as you're now suggesting, right? But one of the things I think we can learn from this is that it's not impossible to change the way that people talk within lived experience. In a fairly short space of time, we've gone, in North America at least, from mocking and ridiculing a person that might want to refer to themselves as they, to just using it in standard everyday practice. And I think actually I've always wanted to use the pronoun they in place of he or she to allow for possible forms of identification, all possible forms, instead of binary forms. So this is something this is our domain, right? This is why I think these conversations are being had in places like this. You're an editor, I'm an editor, we're both writers. People who are watching and participating are artists and writers and critics and commentators. The choice of words we use, the choice of images we use, the paradigms we create will subtly, but also can sometimes quite quickly change the dynamic within a given cultural zone. If we are, as I think we are in the moment, in a time of conjunctural shift. I mean, I think we are in this, there are times where everything's locked down and it's really hard to move the pieces on the board. But right now, I think we're in a time where you can move really fast. I mean, I have personal experience of this when I wrote this grant application that Andrew mentioned at the start. I had to really carefully tiptoe my way around saying, I think monuments should be removed. Now it's foundation policy that monuments should be removed. And I only just started the grant, it got overtaken. That's an excellent sign. So what do you do when this happens? You see two things happen. You see liberalism go, oh my God, we've got to stop this at all possible costs and try and keep things exactly the way they were. Our job, all of those who affiliate and wish to see the kind of transformation that Black Lives Matter encapsulates in that beautiful 3-word phrase, is to accelerate it by all means possible and necessary.
Agreed. Yeah. So we have some questions from the
Cool.
people watching. I guess. Should I? Yeah. Go for it. Yeah.
Sure, Shaw, I'll just jump in real quick. We have 2 questions. Feel free to address them with as much detail as you want. One of them is a historical point about other forms of labor that seem to perhaps complicate or confuse the image of indentured labor, different forms of stock companies, if that sort of is something to address. And then another question about how the long history of the sort of Renaissance use of perspective and the science of optics influences the way in which we talk about subjects and subjectivity. And so if part of a decolonizing process might be to disaggregate or rethink how we talk about subjects in a different approach to the aesthetic or senses of the visual.
Great questions. Well, if I'll chime in, and then Aria, feel free to to jump in at any point. My sense is absolutely yes. I mean, I think, look, I'm going to answer this question sort of within the history of my own field. If you look back at visual culture studies in the 1990s, we're all going on about perspective. And we didn't sufficiently go on at all about this, about what the question has rightly put of subjectivity as mastery. And therefore, if we think of mastery as always within that Hegelian frame of creating the slave master versus the enslaved, we didn't fully or nearly enough address the dimension to which that is a mechanism of white supremacy. I'm glad that we're doing it now. And I think that in the same way that in order to get to another place with monuments, you have to remove the ones that there are and then sit with it for a while. Obviously, I think we need to do the same here. And what that will, you can say back to me, well, we've done that. We had the history of abstract expressionism, but that's not quite what I mean. I don't mean removing forms that are recognizable as attempts to depict the outside world and simply depicting the interior world. I mean, what would it mean to depict a reality in which Black Lives Mattered? What would that look like? What would it mean to depict a world in which people of European descent and all the complexities that involves didn't see themselves as white, just saw themselves as having lineages, having histories, sometimes complex and difficult histories, but not primarily as white. That moment where Edward Colston gets taken down by a multiracial group of people in Bristol, and they don't just take it down, they throw him in the ocean. And that to me creates an articulation with Glissant and his notion of the abyss and the bottom of the ocean, with Gilroy's Black Atlantic, but with a refusal to any longer want to be attached to the white Atlantic, the notion of mastery and domination that Colston literally embodies. So I think that, that's just a beautifully rich question. And I'm also being rightly tagged to think more deeply about the long history of and the nuanced history of ownership of labor and the production of labor throughout the Caribbean and indeed the Atlantic world. And again, this is a work that Robinson causes us to do. And I feel that, one should absolutely do that. And I like the way that you say the traditions of globalization that have their madnesses, corruptions and evils, absolutely. And I think one wants then to think of present day globalization as inherently and ineffably connected in the way that Bembe does to the obliteration of the Blackness, the erasure of indigeneity and those refusals. But the survivance and the persistence of those life worlds and the refusal to disappear that have allowed some of the rest of us to learn from them and to think, actually, that way of thinking about the land owning us rather than we own the land, and therefore we have a duty of care to the land, makes a great deal of sense, a lot more sense than the way that we've been conducting our relation to land as is today only too evident in Colorado. And I know those of you in California need no schooling from me on this. So that there is then these things are deeply interconnected again.
Can I answer also? Yeah, I think the first question made me sort of more of a thing that made me think about. I think that I was thinking about this a lot, sort of perspective, and that's something that I've been very interested in, sort of like the ways that just like the actual techniques of like camera position and and also the training that we have in terms of like, let's say, film theory to identify with the camera. That's been like the major project of like 20th century film theory, is to propose this sort of mode of viewing. And I've been very interested in like a lot of structural materialist filmmakers and the way that they've really written about on a sort of just like material, again, coming from a materialist point of view, like, and an interest in the sort of in a formal way often. But Peter Goodall, from like, who's like a English writer and filmmaker, in his book Flare Out, like there's so many great like the great essays just about like basically that are like unraveling that framework and the idea of representation functioning that way, and then perspective and identification. And there's this bit where he references this Christine Delphi thing about how like if you were to like, and I think it's kind of like a turfy thing, but it's interesting to try to migrate the argument in this framework. But like talks about how like if you were to abolish the sort of like relation between like or basically just like how like if you took away the sort of like the fact that like the relationship between like heterosexual men and women on screen as a part of like self-understanding for many of those women, it would then destabilize their entire understanding of self, which I think again is like incredibly like reductive like vision of like womanhood or sexuality. But in terms of this race question as well, it is interesting to think about if you like in terms of imagining that world that like where the things that white supremacy has like bred as frames no longer exist. It becomes this world without any coordinates in a really interesting way. That then I am really interested in like how would you even begin to tell a story of that world or in that world, because it's a world that like no longer like doesn't have like the physics conceptually of the world that we understand. And so how would you do that on screen? It's a really interesting question. And then the other thing I was going to say with the mercantilism and slave trade stuff, just like a plug for, I've just been rereading Ian Balcom's Spectres of the Atlantic, which is like a great companion, like it's something that's great to read alongside Cedric Robinson as well, in terms of not only does like how slavery and capital are, obviously so deeply related, but also the this argument that like the logics of financial capitalism and globalization are absolutely workshopped through like, the machinations of insurance and that as like a new regime in that moment. And so like that not only does the history of capitalism erase, so much of like Blackness and indigeneity, but also the kind of capitalism that we have now is like completely tethered to the existence of like the Black in the New World in that way. So just another interesting thing that's been on my mind, but yeah.
As Andrew just said in the chat, I love that seeing without coordinates, and I think it's so rich and there's so many things. Oddly, what it made me think of is I often get migraine headaches, and when I have those, my vision absolutely disaggregates, so that I might see you with your head below your shoulders. And when I thought that, I thought, hang on, that's exactly how Europeans depicted New World inhabitants when they arrived. So what they were doing was they were having this, presumably, I think, then maybe this moment of absolute panic at the encounter of something they couldn't make sense of, and impose these coordinates on it, right? And make it make sense through the practices of violence and rape and so on. And here we are at the end of that long night, or perhaps, hopefully, I mean, there have been many ends, but one of the ends that night, in which we have to, I think, then imagine a future that isn't a plantation future. And this is McKittrick's call to us, I think. And I think it's surprisingly hard. And I think we find it, Fred Jameson's quote about the end of capitalism and all that, but I think we find it much easier to imagine dystopian futures. And that we find easy, and that, frankly, we are in one, are we not? But how then do we imagine a future that takes into account the very real difficulties of any life form on this planet going forward, but isn't necessarily dystopian, that allows to a future in which we are seeing without coordinates, in which all forms of embodiment are accepted and thought through and enabled, and everyone can simply live.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I think it requires, it's interesting, again, going back to this sort of seeing and imagining thing. I think it's like, there's so much, I think in terms of the dystopian thing, it's almost like we really are able to speculate upon a pretty terrible present to continue to sort of like perpetuate a dystopian vision of things. And I think that what is difficult is, again, yeah, going back to the abolitionist thing, it's like imagining a world where like we're, like actually untethering, the sort of like, and also again, these logics of finance capital, like untethering the idea of imagining from like speculation based on data sets that are actually based on things that have happened previously, but are, futures, etc. When really it's more like, again, about desire and kind of like, well, yeah, what would be a way of living that would be livable for the most people possible, and, and yeah, like undo these things and build new structures that are actually equitable and, and from conceptually from the ground up, like, workable within these, better frames.
I absolutely. And if we were to just say, like, let's take one practical example of how you might do that, that's become sort of apparent because of the pandemic. And I think the pandemic has kind of paused capital in this interesting way that allows us to look at it. And one thing that's happened is that schools and universities and colleges have had to admit students without grade results from hierarchical segregating exams. And the world has not stopped rotating. The ceiling has not fallen on our heads. And guess what? It turned out that what many of us have been saying all along is you don't actually need to do that. But what you do if you want to separate, segregate, and hierarchize, so that, again, New York City, the schools are more segregated now than before Brown versus the Board of Education, that the so-called selective high schools are uniformly not Black, not Latino, tiny, except for tiny percentages. But here we're learning something from the virus, which is actually we are just doing this to segregate. We've been perfectly able to, and so this is a practical means then of imagining a different kind of future. We've immiserated so many children's lives from the age of 4 to 18 or 19 in pursuit of these meaningless data sets, which are an attachment of whiteness. You know, white people love their data and their measuring and their coordinates and all the rest of it. And we didn't, and we don't have to do it. The university will continue to function. The art school will still be cool. It will be okay. And we're learning that in real time. And so I think that's kind of, you know, just at the level of where I suspect many of us who are chiming in on this conversation actually work. That's something you can actually do right now.
Well, I think our time's up, right?
Time's up.
Yeah.
That's about it. If you have any final remarks. Nope,
No.
feeling good. Well,
Really,
it was.
Thank you, Aria.
Yeah, thank you. It's very fun. We have much to discuss.
Definitely.
And together as an audience, let's thank our two wonderful speakers tonight, both a presenter as well as a respondent. I think it was such an enlivening conversation. I'd like to thank you all as an audience. Thank you for joining us this week, but also look forward to the future. We're going to be having Calvin Warren and Lynette Park very soon. We're going to have the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. And then finally, Brian Jefferson Johnson is going to be talking about crime information, crime mapping, and how that works. So tune in here again at tiny.cc 2020 WHAP. And note that Aria has a solo show coming up in Red Cat this winter, and the visualizing abolition series sounds really wonderful through UCSC. So, you know, look up all of that. And thanks again for joining us today.